In the first part of Chapter 3, The Suicide of Thought, from Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton suggested that the greatest danger facing the human race was the thought that kills thought. When we as a culture decided that there is no God, we also lost objective truth. And without truth, thinking itself is destroyed. He explained this idea in general terms, but he anticipates that some will be reluctant to accept this general warning without some more details. So he takes the second part of this chapter to run through specific modern ways of thinking that kills thought. He starts with evolution. Evolution is a good example of that modern intelligence which, if it destroys anything, destroys itself. Evolution is either an innocent scientific description of how certain earthly things came about, or if it is anything more than this, it is an attack upon thought itself. If evolution destroys anything, it does not destroy religion, but rationalism. If evolution simply means that a positive thing called an ape turned very slowly into a positive thing called a man, then it is stingless for the most orthodox, for a personal God might just as well do things slowly as quickly, especially if, like the Christian God, he were outside time. But if it means anything more, it means that there is no such thing as an ape to change, and no such thing as a man for him to change into. It means that there is no such thing as a thing. At best, there is only one thing, and that is a flux of everything and anything. This is an attack not upon the faith, but upon the mind. You cannot think if there are no things to think about. You cannot think if you are not separate from the subject of thought. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." The philosophic evolutionist reverses and negatives the epigram. He says, "I am not, therefore I cannot think." Chesterton differentiates between two different ways to understand evolution. One is, it's a scientific description of how life may have developed over time, even how God may have made a good man from a good ape. According to Chesterton, this idea of evolution is no threat to Christianity. In fact, most strains of Orthodox Christianity are fine with it. God can create things slowly, just as easily as he can create things quickly. God exists outside of time, after all. But if evolution becomes bigger than that kind of description, it destroys more than religion, it destroys thought. This is how it does this. If there is no God, and we are a product only of evolution, then the idea of 2 + 2 making 4, and that it's wrong to throw acid in a child's face, well, these are just products of evolution. Something underneath these ideas made us better able to survive in some way. They aren't true. They are just the products of unguided evolution. Well, if that's the case, nothing can be true. I can't even point to a toaster and say, "That's a toaster." When this second kind of evolution takes down reason, we don't even have an ape for a human being to evolve into. How can a thing be a thing if you don't have the means by which to describe and differentiate it from other things? That's what thinking is. Some people thought and still think that evolution is a nail in Christianity's coffin, but it's not. It's a nail in the coffin of reason. You can't think if you are not a human subject who is a separate thing from an ape or a toaster. This might sound very philosophical, and I suppose it is, but if human thinking isn't rooted to the idea that some things are true, then you can't even say something like this is an ape and not a man. Make sense? Truth needs to be possible in order to say that. Then Chesterton goes on to the other end of the spectrum, for his next example of another thought that kills thought. Then there is the opposite attack on thought, that urged by Mr. H.G. Wells when he insists that every separate thing is unique, and there are no categories at all. This also is merely destructive. Thinking means connecting things, and stops if they cannot be connected. It need hardly be said that if this skepticism forbidding thought necessarily forbids speech, a man cannot open his mouth without contradicting it. Thus, when Mr. Wells says, as he did somewhere, all chairs are quite different, he utters not merely a misstatement, but a contradiction in terms. If all chairs were quite different, you could not call them all chairs. H.G. Wells has an equally dangerous idea. His idea is that everything is absolutely unique, that categories don't exist. There is no such thing as chairs or cats or toasters. Here's his chain of thought. Wells starts with the notion that there is nothing that transcends the physical world. There is nothing up there, no God, so no reason. This means that the idea of chairness is impossible because it would imply an idea that's higher than the physical chair. Well, we can't have that, so everything, every single chair, every cat, every toaster must be absolutely unique. At least he's being consistent. If there is no God, no universal truth, no objective morality, then there can't be any transcendent ideas or forms either. The problem with this is that it defies common sense. His problem is that he starts with his philosophy, and then he forces experience to fit into it. Chesterton will argue throughout this book that we should start with our experience, and then seek a philosophy that best makes sense of it. H.G. Wells's idea destroys thought because thinking means making connections. And if nothing is connected, then there is no thinking. This approach also means that speaking is practically annihilated. If you say anything, you contradict Wells's foundational premise, right? If all toasters are totally unique, you can't even use the word toaster, because it implies a general category. Chesterton's next example of thought obliteration has to do with the myth of progress. Akin to these is the false theory of progress, which maintains that we alter the test instead of trying to pass the test. We often hear it said, for instance, "What is right in one age is wrong in another." This is quite reasonable if it means that there is a fixed aim, and that certain methods attain at certain times and not at other times. If women, say, desire to be elegant, it may be that they are improved at one time by growing fatter and at another time by growing thinner. But you cannot say that they are improved by ceasing to wish to be elegant and beginning to wish to be oblong. If the standard changes, how can there be improvement, which implies a standard? Nietzsche started a nonsensical idea that men had once sought as good what we now call evil. If it were so, we could not talk of surpassing or even falling short of them. How can you overtake Jones if you walk in the other direction? You cannot discuss whether one people has succeeded more in being miserable than another succeeded in being happy. It would be like discussing whether Milton was more puritanical than a pig is fat. The way we think about progress these days destroys thought as well. Built into the word progress is the idea that things are better now than they were before. And it's true that infant mortality is lower and literacy rates are higher. Progress has been made. Lower infant mortality rates and higher literacy rates only show progress if we all agree that these are good things. If a society decides that books are nothing but purveyors of dangerous ideas, then increased literacy rates is not an improvement, right? You can't have progress without a fixed standard. You just have change. It is true that a man, a silly man, might make change itself his object or ideal. But as an ideal, change itself becomes unchangeable. If the change worshipper wishes to estimate his own progress, he must be sternly loyal to the idea of change. He must not begin to flirt gaily with the idea of monotony. Progress itself cannot progress. It is worth remark in passing that when Tennyson, in a wild and rather weak manner, welcomed the idea of infinite alteration in society, he instinctively took a metaphor which suggests an imprisoned tedium. He wrote, "Let the great world spin forever down the ringing grooves of change." He thought of change itself as an unchangeable groove. And so it is. Change is about the narrowest and hardest groove that a man can get into. The main point here, however, is that this idea of a fundamental alteration in the standard is one of the things that makes thought about the past or future simply impossible. The theory of a complete change of standards in human history does not merely deprive us of the pleasure of honoring our fathers. It deprives us even of the more modern and aristocratic pleasure of despising them. In essence, we need an external standard by which we judge the changes over time. With this standard, we can judge if things are better. Are people better off the way we do things now than the way we did them in the past? If they are, then we've made progress. If they are not, then we have failed to do so. If we don't have the standard, we cannot think about improvement. Things are just as they are. The next example of thought destroying thinking is pragmatism. This bald summary of the thought-destroying forces in our time would not be complete without some reference to pragmatism. For though I have here used, and should everywhere defend the pragmatist method as a preliminary guide to truth, there is an extreme application of it which involves the absence of all truth whatever. My meaning can be put shortly thus. I agree with the pragmatist that apparent objective truth is not the whole matter, that there is an authoritative need to believe the things that are necessary to the human mind. But I say that one of those necessities precisely is a belief in objective truth. The pragmatist tells a man to think what he must think, and never mind the absolute. But precisely one of the things that he must think is the absolute. This philosophy, indeed, is a kind of verbal paradox. Pragmatism is a matter of human needs. And one of the first of human needs is to be something more than a pragmatist. Extreme pragmatism is just as inhuman as the determinism it so powerfully attacks. The determinist, who to do him justice does not pretend to be a human being, makes nonsense of the human sense of actual choice. The pragmatist, who professes to be specifically human, makes nonsense of the human sense of actual fact. The last thought-destroying idea that has gained a strong foothold in our society is pragmatism. Pragmatists, in essence, believe in results. A pragmatist is practical and simply goes with what works. They might not be all that concerned with the morality of things. Chesterton agrees with the pragmatist that objective truth or absolute values aren't everything. There are necessities that don't flow out of transcendent truth. But he contends that the existence of objective truth is a practical necessity. Radical pragmatists want to do away with absolutes like the good and the true and the beautiful. These, they feel, need not be considered. They are not necessities. Chesterton has been arguing all along that absolutes are necessary for thought. Radical pragmatists deny absolutes, thus they kill thought. Pragmatism is the enemy of determinism, but they are both just as bad. Determinism destroys thought by denying choice, and the pragmatist destroys thought by denying facts. The facts they deny? The existence of absolutes. To sum up our contention so far, we may say that the most characteristic current philosophies have not only a touch of mania, but a touch of suicidal mania. The mere questioner has knocked his head against the limits of human thought, and cracked it. This is what makes so futile the warnings of the orthodox, and the boasts of the advanced about the dangerous boyhood of free thought. What we are looking at is not the boyhood of free thought. It is the old age and ultimate dissolution of free thought. It is vain for bishops and pious bigwigs to discuss what dreadful things will happen if wild skepticism runs its course. It has run its course. It is vain for eloquent atheists to talk of the great truths that will be revealed if once we see free thought begin. We have seen it end. It has no more questions to ask. It has questioned itself. You cannot call up any wilder vision than a city in which men ask themselves if they have any selves. You cannot fancy a more skeptical world than that in which men doubt if there is a world. It might certainly have reached its bankruptcy more quickly and cleanly if it had not been feebly hampered by the application of indefensible laws of blasphemy, or by the absurd pretense that modern England is Christian. But it would have reached bankruptcy anyhow. Militant atheists are still unjustly persecuted, but rather because they are an old minority than because they are a new one. Free thought has exhausted its own freedom. It is weary of its own success. If any eager free thinker now hails philosophic freedom as the dawn, he is only like the man in Mark Twain, who came out wrapped in blankets to see the sun rise, and was just in time to see it set. If any frightened curate still says that it will be awful if the darkness of free thought should spread, we can only answer him in the high and powerful words of Mr. Belloc. Do not, I beseech you, be troubled about the increase of forces already in dissolution. You have mistaken the hour of the night. It is already morning. We have no more questions left to ask. We have looked for questions in the darkest corners and on the wildest peaks. We have found all the questions that can be found. It is time we gave up looking for questions and began looking for answers. In this paragraph, Chesterton wraps up a section in which he offers all kinds of ways in which modern thought is a thought killer. People have questioned everything so hard that they've broken the very tools of thinking. Today we've gone so deep into doubt that people now question everything: meaning, purpose, identity, even whether they exist or not, or whether reality exists, This is not brave or liberating, it's absurd and paralyzing. Chesterton concludes like this: it's time to stop tearing down and start rebuilding, not with more questions, but with real answers. In many ways, I cannot imagine Chesterton's book being more relevant to his day than it is to ours. We will stay in the same chapter for our next video, where Chesterton will take up one more philosophy of his day: the people that think that individual choice should be the guiding principle of our lives. And that's one of our guiding principles too, isn't it? Join me next time when we discuss the third and final part of The Suicide of Thought from G.K. Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy.